Today I'm going to go over my full workflow process of creating the render you just saw of the Apple AirPods Max. I'll go over my modeling, import, export workflow, how I created the materials, how I blended certain materials together using masks. The main chunk of the video will be the cinematics of it, so how I set up the render shots, or the camera shots, the lighting, timing it all together, how I animate the objects using different techniques and actors and nulls and things like that. I'll also go over the final render settings and how I plan and import all of my shots into one master sequence track. Hopefully this is a fun one. Like and subscribe, check out my links below, and let's get started. So starting off in Cinema 4D, this is the model I had downloaded from Dimensiva. I imported an FBX and it comes in with all these material IDs. So if I jump into them, for example, the metal chrome and select, you'll see it'll select everything that's chrome. Or if I do the pads that are black, it'll select those as well. One thing to note, not that it really matters, I realized the inner cup modeling isn't completely 100% accurate to the physical product, but I've realized that too late, so we'll just move on from that. Now, one thing I did do to the model is, although it comes in this single object with material selections, there were some objects or parts of the model that I found needed a few more subdivisions. So I had made a copy of the scene and split up the model into the different materials or into the different selection sets. So pretty much what that means is I just got the base model, went into the polygon editing mode, select whatever I wanted. So one of them for sure, I think, was the pad black, which is the pads. And then you can hit UP or right click and split, so same thing. And then that'll make a separate object. So I'll just undo that. So these are the different parts that I had split up and subdivided. Some of them, like the pads and the body, but I left a few of the others the same because subdividing them would kind of mess up the mesh, and because, as you can see, it is like triangulated and not quads, some of the areas around the buttons did have some issues. So if I did have more time, I probably would have tried to remesh it and then clean up some of those holes, because they do get a bit glitchy or the normals mess up when importing into Unreal. The next important thing that you want to know, although you might have this model, whatever your product is, you will have all your different selection sets that are correctly, assigned. You still need to make sure that you have materials assigned to these selections. So if I go here, you'll see it comes with all these materials. You can't just do this where you have your product with the correct selection sets, because Unreal will not recognize those different polygon selections. So when it imports in, it'll just come in as one single material. So definitely make sure you have materials assigned to the different selections before exporting this out of Cinema or whatever program you are using. And the last thing we want to make sure of before exporting is, say you want your model to come in as one singular object in Unreal and then just have multiple materials assigned to that one object. You want to make sure that all of your objects are in a connect generator before exporting. Otherwise, for example, say you just exported this null right here as an FBX, Unreal would import each of these objects individually, but if you export a connect object, it'll join all those things together as well as respect all the selection sets. So definitely keep that in mind. And by the way, even with my split up objects, I have still retained all the selection. I've made sure all the selection sets or the polygon selections consistent. So these all still have, the metal chrome, even though it's not in this object, like there's no chrome in the pads. But just to make sure in Unreal that there's no overlapping or messing up of material IDs, I would highly recommend to just keep all your selection sets named the same and across all of your objects that you've copied. If you are splitting up your object because you want to subdivide something, I would recommend subdividing it in your software and then baking that down. So for example, I had subdivided the pads, as you can see, and these are like the original pads that were not subdivided. So what I did was put it in a subdivision modifier, and then I just did a right click and connect objects, which pretty much baked it down, and then that's how I got this guy right here. So you want to make sure you bake down all your subdivisions before exporting, because if you let the FBX bake it for you, you will lose your material IDs in that process. So once you're happy with your model, just select your connect object or whatever object you're exporting, make sure it's enabled, then do a file, export selected objects as, and then do FBX. And these settings worked for me. They're pretty close to default, I think, but one thing I would note is I have my subdivision surface on generator instead of baked, because I found baking could get rid of my material IDs sometimes, so just keep that in mind. Make sure you have your materials checked as well. Baked materials doesn't really matter too much, but just make sure they are selected so that Unreal brings in all of these guys with the correct naming conventions, because that'll be super helpful when materializing your render or your model later on. Okay, let's jump into Unreal now. So I am in Unreal Engine 5.3.2. This is just a blank scene, and I've copied over one of my post-process volumes. Just quickly to go over the post-process volume settings. Obviously, first thing you want to set it to infinite extent unbound, so make sure you have that checked. I've got my exposure, auto exposure just completely turned off, so my min and max EV is on 0, and my exposure compensation is also on 0. And if I do want it to be a bit brighter or darker in terms of exposure, I will do that in my camera settings rather than the post-process, because sometimes depending on the shot or the type of light, I'll want it to be overexposed or underexposed. And then the next two settings, I've just made my bloom 0 and also my lens flare also 0. And lastly, but not least, my lumen settings. I've just got pretty much all the quality sliders maxed out, final gather maxed out, and I'm using hit lighting for reflections because that gives the highest quality lumen reflections. And quality onto high quality translucency doesn't really matter for this, and that's about it. That should be good to go for your post-process volume setup. Next thing we'll do is import in our product. So I'm going to import it in using the simple method just because it's one product and I don't need the whole hierarchy breakdown because it is one single object. Because I know some people like to do import into level, which is definitely good for more complex scenes. But for this case where it's just one thing, we can just do import and then select your FBX. Essentially, I think this is on by default. I'll explain what this is later on, but everything else can be on default. You want to make sure you create new materials because it'll look for the material IDs correctly that way. And that should be about it, and then just hit import. Cool. So I'm just going to go to unlit mode, or you could also hit Alt-3, drag this guy in, and then zero him out. And this is our product. And it's come in with all the materials we had in Cinema, and also named correctly with all the different elements that we wanted. So definitely pay attention to these materials, and when you are creating your actual materials in Unreal, I would highly recommend to just name them the same. So as you can see here, nope, wrong one. Here I've called like M pad black, MI plastic black, and I'll just quickly go through a couple of these right now to show you what my setup is. First, I'm just going to chuck in a couple of lights so we can see what is going on. If you chuck in a light and it's still coming in pitch black, it's probably because the materials are just not working correctly. Sometimes the materials imported through FBX will just have 0 specular or something like that. So what I'll do in that case is just go from lit to lighting only, and now you'll have just like a basic default white material applied to everything in your scene. Once you start applying your new materials that you'll make in Unreal, then your objects will correctly reflect the lights in your scene, so don't freak out if it stays pitch black. So for the materials, I've just used, for at least the speaker pads and like the headband, I've just used the textures that obviously came with the model and a very basic setup. So I'll just do something like this, call it M underscore, actually let's just check, for example, pad black. So I'll call it the exact same thing just to keep it all clean, M underscore pad black. Open it up. I'm using Substrate, but it doesn't matter too much for this workflow at all, so you can use whatever you want, the default shading or Substrate. And then what I'll do next is find anything that is the pad black. Headphone pad, diffuse, normal, ref, and I think that's it. So just drag those guys in. This is the diffuse, which is the base color. This will be the reflection, which will be roughness. And as you can see, it's very glossy, which means this, because it's a reflection map, not a roughness map, we probably need to invert it. So what I would do is just drag out of the RGB, type in a 1-, drag that into roughness. And now you can see we have the correct reflections on the material. And then lastly, obviously, is the normal map. So just drag that into normal. And then the final thing I'll do is just get an MF tiling, which is a material function tiling, which should come in default with your project. If not, just import a Quixel material in, and then you will now have access to this function. And what that will let us do is just adjust the UV tiling of the material. So drag that into your UVs, hit apply. And before we actually apply it to the pads, we are going to create a material instance, call it mi underscore pad black. And if I go back to unlit mode, Alt 3, I'll find pad black, drag it in. And now you'll see we have the pads in there. Obviously the tiling is way too big, so this is where you jump into your material instance and then up it to like 10 and 10. That's a bit too much. Maybe 5 and 5, maybe 4 and 4. Looks a bit better. And yeah, it's that simple. So I just did that with each of these materials, which I'll show you later on. For the body though, which is like that sort of aluminium brushed, not brushed, but like that sort of semi-glossy aluminium finish, I used a Grayscale Gorilla material for that, which was the anodized space gray, which is this guy. A really simple setup, to be honest. If you want to make your own, I would just recommend, let me open this up, just make a noise map in Unreal, which by the way I have a video on. Make a noise map in Unreal or any software, even in Photoshop, that is seamless. And if I just type in noise map seamless, just get any of these guys, right? Any seamless noise map, and then tile it super small, like how I just showed you how to do the tiling, and then plug that same map into the metallic, or you can just turn up the metallic and then just use the tiny noise map as a roughness, and that'll get you the same effect essentially. Because if we zoom in to these guys, that is essentially what this is. You can see here, it's just a low contrast, super tiny tiling noise map. Obviously the Grayscale Gorilla one looks super nice and the finish is really good, and there's a few little, you know, there's a nice noise in the normal map as well, but you could easily create that tiny noise map and then also apply it into the normal map. If you want to learn how to make a bump map work as a normal map in Unreal, check out my last video, I think it was, the UE5 materials video. I definitely go over that workflow and it can be super useful. So now I'm in the level that I was working in for the animation. And as you can see here, this is the aluminium body that I was talking about. And the model came with a mask for this little plastic, I think plastic antenna band at the bottom of the headphones, and if I go to the product renders, you can see here on the website, I think it's for the Bluetooth so that the connectivity isn't disrupted and can pass through the headphones. So this is where I had to blend the aluminium body with a metal plastic in one single material. So I'll just show you how to do that now. This can be super useful for labels, any logos, any stamps or branding that you want to mix in with another material, and definitely a video I might make an in-depth tutorial on, but this is just a basic way of how to do that right now. Now, a quick disclaimer about the material setup. I'm using Substrate in Unreal Engine 5, which is their more experimental, newer material workflow. However, if you are using the default Unreal Engine material shading, this will work as well, but you'll just need to use a different method, and I highly recommend this video on screen, and I'll leave a link in the description for combining two materials into one. Essentially, you make two material functions and then use a get material attributes in a third material and then combine the two. I know this won't make sense right now, but it's actually quite simple, so just watch the video if you want to figure that one out. And if you are using Substrate, which I am, this is the workflow for that. It's actually very simple as well. You can't use the material attributes method, but they have created, or they as in Epic have created their own way within Unreal to do that. So let me find that material, body blended, yep. So essentially I have two materials set up. If I just move this guy up, these are the two separate materials that I have. So this bottom one is the aluminium, and this top one is just a very basic kind of plasticky looking one. And the aluminium is really just those Grayscale Gorilla textures I was showing you earlier, just plugged in, and then there's got a little tiling thing, which is, this is pretty much that material function, the MF_tiling that I was showing you earlier. This is just that, but you know, unpacked. And this is the setup. Really, the key to this is using a horizontal blend. So what you would do before that is go type in Substrate slab, make one of these, and then make another Substrate slab. And these would be your two materials. So that's what I have here. Once you have set up those materials, you want to use a horizontal blend. So what that is essentially is, in Substrate, there is a vertical blend and a horizontal blend. What a vertical blend is think of like one base material and then the next one right on top of it, and then you're blending between the two. So really good for like translucent materials or coating materials like car paint, or that opal car texture material that they did in their showcase. So really good for that, but in our case, we want a horizontal blend, which is blending materials side by side. I don't know if that makes sense, but we want to go from metal to then plastic. So we just want to put two materials next to each other, and super simple. So I plug in my metal or aluminium into the background, and then I plug in my really basic plastic setup, which is just a color, zero metallic, some specular and roughness into the diffuse, albedo and the roughness, and that goes into the foreground material. And then I will just use this mask for the mix, and then you plug that into front material, and that's all you got to do. So really simple setup. And now that way, if I go down here and I made a material instance of that, now I have control over that plastic color as well as the roughness of it and all of that stuff. So if you want to learn more about creating a master material, I also have a video on that called UE5. I know the thumbnail is UE5 materials. I'll link it right now and go check that out, but really useful tips in there to create parameters that you can edit in a material instance. The only other thing to note with the materials would probably be this material here with an opacity map, but essentially what you want to do is, say you create a new material and you want to use an opacity mask, you just want to select the result node and just make sure the blend mode is set from opaque to masked, and that'll give you this opacity mask input, which is then where I plugged in this guy. So that way I can plug in my mask and it'll give you this result. So definitely take advantage of that if you have netting or any other masked out material, including something like this as well. So that should be it for materials. Now let's jump into the fun stuff, which is lighting, cameras, rendering, and all the cinematics of that. So the lighting and the camera animations and cinematics is all sort of mixed together. So I'll try to show you both at the same time. But the first thing I will show you is this white background HDRI backdrop. So I'll just hit G to hide the in-game icons to go in and out of that. So for this backdrop, it's actually pretty much just a white background that is not affecting the lighting of my product at all. And to set that up is first you'll want an HDRI backdrop, and if you do not have that option, usually it shows up here in the plus icon, lights, HDRI backdrop. If it is not there, go to your plugins and type in HDRI and then enable that and restart your engine. So all I've done is I'll show you right now, I'll drag it in, zero it out. Oh, actually we're all right here. But say you have something near the floor, it'll actually cast shadows on it. So I sort of just move it down a few, like a couple hundred units usually, because I don't have any animations happening around there. And then I'll also increase the size to like 1500 to make it bigger. Now, obviously, currently this is affecting my product, as you can see in the reflections and the lighting, which looks fine. It might be the look you're after. I just wanted it to be a backdrop, and then all of my lighting will be done in Sequencer, which I'll show you in a sec. So sorry, let me stay on track. What I did was I just dragged in an HDRI backdrop, and I have just made a gray, like a mid-gray HDR texture in Photoshop and imported that in. I have a download link to this, I'm pretty sure, in my soft lighting tutorial. So if you want to grab that, you can do it, or just go into Photoshop and make it yourself. So I just dragged it in and then made this. Now, obviously, if I make this brighter, it'll also make my product brighter, and I lose a lot of the contrast that I had before, as you can see. But if I want to make the background brighter without actually injecting any light into the scene, all you got to do is drag this little window down, select your skylight, and then just change the intensity to 0. And now what you can do, click the parent again, drag this guy up. I can make this 50 now, which is pretty white. There's a bit of gray down there. You might want that gradient. If you don't, you could just move it further down. So make it minus 2000. So now the floor is really low. And here, now you've got a good white background. And the reason I chose it was because that's kind of what what Apple uses in their marketing. And you could do it in post, but I wanted to see it live in the viewport so I could kind of get an idea of what my camera shots will look like and how I want to balance the black and white or contrast in the shots. If you do want to render yours as a PNG and then do the background in post, check out my render passes video. I know I'm plugging a lot of my videos in this one, but it really can be helpful. You can just render out as a PNG with the background transparent and then add in your background in post. Now for the camera shots, really simple. Let me delete this second HDRI, turn this guy on, and I'll just go to my sequencer folder, and I have a tech product, and I'll make one from scratch with you guys right now, but just to give you an example, this was my first shot. And if I go into a double viewport, I'll put my camera shot on the left here. So if you just click on your left viewport and then hit camera, that'll select it. You don't want to hit the camera cut because that'll take over both your viewports. So just make sure you hit the camera icon here. And if you don't know how to get a 2-pane viewport, all you got to do is go into this little hamburger icon. In layouts, just select 2 panes. So if I go out of game mode, all I did was create a fresh sequence, And if your window doesn't pop up here, you can dock it into the bottom like this. Created a fresh sequence, clicked this button to create a cinema camera in my sequencer itself, and also it makes it spawnable, which is nice, so I don't have a million cameras in my outliner. I know this isn't the most organized thing, but you know, allow me. So I'll just create a camera, change the settings that I wanted, and then I would have these lights, which are just these rectangular lights in the scene, and just animate their intensity and their position. So as you can see, as I move the timeline, well, I can't see it moving when I hit play, it goes to game view. But if I move the timeline, you can kind of see here these lights moving as the camera moves. So let's set up a basic sequence ourselves and recreate this sort of shot. So I'll just jump into my fresh folder, tutorial, and then right click, cinematics, level sequence, and I'll call this ls underscore whatever my project name is, or level name. So I'll just call this AirPods Max underscore S1 for shot one. Just double click to open, and first thing we will do is just hit this button, create a new camera, and it'll automatically pilot it for you. And now we have the cinema camera, which has depth of field and everything that we want. Now, the first thing I'll actually do is zoom out here by holding Control and scrolling out. And I will set my marker by checking this box and setting it to 300, which is 10 seconds at 30 FPS. And then I will hit the right bracket to go all the way out, and then drag my camera cut a little past it just to make sure we are covered in our in and out range. If you want to learn more about sequencer techniques in depth, my last product render video was the iPhone in Unreal Engine, so I definitely go over a bit more of the sequencer stuff there. But again, sorry to keep plugging my stuff, but that'll have some helpful tips for you. Anyway, so back to this. First thing I want to do is actually get my crop to be correct. But so because this is going to be going on Instagram as a reel, I want to change my crop settings here. As you can see, I have some favorites set here. You probably will not have them. So what you want to do is scroll down into your crop settings, and you can change the cropped aspect ratio there. And if you do want to add it to your favorites, which I highly recommend doing, just right click and then you'll have add to favorites, and that way it'll always be at the top, so you can, you know, change what you want the crop to be whenever you want without scrolling down every time. So let me scroll back down. Cropped aspect ratio, I know for reels is 0.5625, so that is a real aspect ratio. And then I will go to the focus settings, get my eyedropper, and then click my headphones. Now, currently, as you can see, the aperture is super low, so my plane of focus is really sharp. And if I draw my debug plane, you can see this is what's currently in focus. And I found with smaller objects, even like an F22 still gives it this sort of like tilt shift look, which I'm not a huge fan of. Like I kind of just want everything to be in focus all the time, similar to like the advertisement. So even if I make the manual focusing super far out, we don't really get that super sharp look. So we kind of need to do a bit of cheating here with the camera. So scroll up on the right. Let me drag this window high, the details panel. Also, one thing I forgot to do, I usually change from digital film to DSLR, and that'll give you this sort of aspect ratio. And then select my camera again, and I will change the max f-stop to like 10,000. So now what that means is we can now make this like 10,000, and now everything will be pretty sharp. There are times where it'll go a little bit out of focus, and you can just use the eyedropper to bring that back in. But now everything will be in focus, and I don't need to worry about a blurry shot if I do want everything to be tack sharp. Now the next thing I'll do is I will kind of find the angle I'm after. So let's say it's something like this. I will go to the front of my timeline, and maybe I'll play with my focal length a bit, which is down here. I've added it to my favorites, so it's a lot easier to grasp. And because it's like kind of maybe a detail shot where I want a lot of the object to be covering the camera and I don't want a lower focal length, I guess I could do something like this. So I'll start here, and then in the twirl down, I will add a keyframe for my transform, and then I'll go to the end of my timeline, and then maybe just like move around a bit that way, and then hit another keyframe. And then we'll just see how that looks. So we got like this nice slow pan. However, I can tell the speed is ramping up and down because these are cubic. So if I go to the curve editor and select this guy, you can see the movement is on a curve. So I want it to be a linear movement. So you can select both, right click and hit linear, or a shortcut is if I make it back to cubic, you can just select both and hit 4, and that'll make it linear. And then 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of do the different interpolation modes. So 4 is linear. So something like that I'm happy with. And once I'm happy with the shot, now I will start adding in my lights. These are the basic rectangular lights that I've created. On some of them, you might notice any of these guys. Yeah, with this guy, you'll see I have a gradient texture on it. And that is just a very simple gradient texture that I made in Photoshop and then exported out as a JPEG just to get some softer fall-offs with my lighting. Again, I go over this in my iPhone and Unreal Engine tutorial if you want to learn more about that, but you just make a gradient texture, drag it in, and that'll get the job done. You will need to increase the brightness when using these textures, but not a big deal for this case. And let me find my light that is affecting this scene. So this guy is definitely one of them. So I will drag him in. These are the settings of the rectangular light. So if I go drop down light, rect light, that's kind of what I've brought in. So super low intensity, pretty low attenuation radius, which is this fall off, which is the sphere that you see around surrounding it. Sorry, very low source width and height, and everything else is pretty much the same. I'm just using white for the light color, no temperature in these. And that's about it. So really basic settings. So what I'll do is say I want the light to maybe just end there, around there maybe. I will hit the drop down, add a transform track, and then hit plus for the keyframe, but I'll drag that to the end. And then I'll go back to the beginning. Make sure you deselect this keyframe, otherwise you'll override it. And then I will move this back to maybe here when it's pure black, and then hit plus for the keyframe. And then you'll hit play, and then you'll see I'll slowly get the light kind of bleeding in. And then maybe I want another light coming in from the left. So what we could do is I'll just create a new light, which is this guy, as you can see, huge. 2020, make the barn door length 0 because it's really distracting and I'm not really using it. And obviously way too bright right now. I'll just drag it in place. I kind of like the high contrast look though. So if I go to like 0.1, 1, 0.2, turn it on and off. Maybe I just need to rotate it this way a bit. Oh yeah, something there could be nice. Like getting some rim light on the top here. So what I would do is do the exact same thing, sort of drag it away, put it in this sequence. add a transform track. So hit the plus, transform, add a keyframe, and then at the end, maybe you want the rim light to come sooner. So at frame 150, drag it in. I've lost where I want it to shine. This is a very realistic depiction of what it's like. We can just put it there for now, and then hit plus again, go to the beginning, and now as my camera moves, I've hit spacebar to play, and you can see the light coming in. Doesn't look great, but that's kind of the whole workflow of this process. And you can select the viewport that you want to maximize and hit F11. And if you are using cinematic viewport, sometimes you'll be on default viewport. Just change it to cinematic and then go back into your camera. Sometimes you can go to default and it'll reset everything. Don't worry about it. Just click it again, hit the camera icon, and then go F11 to maximize. Sorry, go back to cinematic, hit F11 after selecting the camera, then maximize, and now you've got this timeline within your viewport, which can be super useful. Okay, so now that I have gone over the basics of creating a camera shot, here are a few techniques that I use a lot in these scenarios. So if I just open up this shot here, this is a shot that I didn't end up using in the final thing, but it's kind of this camera rotating around a point or a target. So I don't know why the target it's definitely moved. Let me see. Yeah, this guy. So as you can see, my camera is always pointed towards this target, which means orbiting around is super smooth, and you don't need to worry about like keyframes interpolating weird and then your camera like tilts the wrong way or something. So I definitely recommend using a target. I'm going to show you now a basic setup of how to do that. So I'm going to go back into my tutorial sequence folder and duplicate this by hitting Control D. This is also something I do a lot, where I'll finish one shot, duplicate it, because I know I'm going to do a similar shot for the next one. And it also auto renames it for you, which is nice. So we'll go into this camera here, and I will just delete the keyframes. I don't know why this automatically created a keyframe, but I'll delete that as well. And I will delete the camera keyframes. So I have lost the headphones. There they are. Okay. By the way, to do that, if you ever do get lost, you can select the object and then hit F, and that will target or focus on the object that you had selected. So let's say this is the shot we want actually. And what we can do is make a target. So honestly, a big hack in Unreal that I don't see that many people using, but I think is super useful, especially in product viz and things like that, is using actors for pulling focus or using it for targets of cameras or other objects. So what you want to think of this as is kind of like an empty null in Cinema 4D that you'd use to help rotate things, which I'll show you later on, or just group things up without having to merge objects together. So just click the drop down plus button, go to basic and then actor, and then zero out the coordinates down here, and then I'll just drag it up. So I'll drag it up. As you can see, I already have another one there, but that's fine for now. I will place it roughly in the center. Yep. And then hit F2 to rename, and I'll call it target shot 2. Although you can call it whatever you want. As you can see, I have a few here. And you want to select your camera, and on the details panel, do enable lookout tracking. And then type in the actor to track, type in target, and then do target S2. And now you can see if I move my target, my camera follows it. And now the beauty of this is my camera. I can go to the beginning of the timeline, hit a keyframe, go to the end, and then By the way, I'm switching between local coordinate and world coordinates for the pivot point. I think you can do it manually by clicking this object, this button here, or you can do Control tilde to change that. So I'll go to the world coordinates because I find it can be a bit buggy on the local. So I'll go to world and then move it. I know it gets a bit glitchy, but I'll move it there and then hit another keyframe, select both of them, press 4 to make it linear. I'll go to the beginning, and now you can see I have a perfectly smooth rotation focusing around a single point on the screen. So really useful. And quick tip as well, if you are doing depth of field stuff, you can also track an actor as well in your scene. So think of these as like points in 3D space that you can track, and it can be very useful for pulling focus like I mentioned before, or shifting focus, all those sorts of things, or locking your focus on a certain point without worrying about moving the camera back and forth and constantly changing the focus distance. So the next thing, sorry I've shown so many things, but I really think these things can be quite useful, and I've just said thing 50 times. The next thing or technique I want to show you is using these basic empty actors to animate your object. So I'm pretty sure shot 7, is it? Nope, not shot 7. Okay, this is one of my favorite shots in the scene. Sorry, I've just gotten up, and as you can see, my camera is static and I'm just moving the headphones or rotating it slowly, just because it's a lot easier to capture the shot that way rather than manually keyframing the camera or moving it along a spline. So what I've actually done, as you can see here, is I've just gotten an actor and animated its rotation, and I haven't actually rotated the object itself, because sometimes you want the object to be static in another shot and you don't want to mess up the coordinates. So you just want to use a keyframe, an actor, a basic actor or a null. So how do we do this? Let me go back to that other shot we just made, which is this guy. And I'll put on the left viewport. So we have this guy. And let's make this 20 seconds. And go out, drag the camera cut all the way out. And instead of this, I'll make it go all the way to the other side. And then override it, and then drag my keyframe all the way out. So hopefully that looks good. Cool. Now, what if we wanted to animate this rotating the other way using an actor rather than animating the object itself? Because some of you might have a product that has different static meshes in the hierarchy and you don't want to mess with that. So what is the best course of action? Well, what we can do is create another empty or basic actor. So basic actor, zero out the coordinates. I'll call it rotator S2. You could call it transform 1 and then transform 2 if you're applying other animations to it, but this is what I like to do. I will select this guy, and I think for you guys on default, your static meshes will be set to static, but what you actually want to do is make sure it's on movable, because if it's on static, you won't be able to make it a child of an actor. So where is the guy we just made? Rotator S2 is down here. So I will select my headphones, drag it on top of rotator S2. And now if I move this guy down here, you can see it'll control all the children underneath its hierarchy, which is very useful. I don't know why it's auto keyframing when I have it turned off. So I don't know if it's a bug. Anyway, what you can now do is drag rotator S2 into your sequence, add a plus transform track, maybe put a keyframe there, go to the end. If the camera is moving left to right or counterclockwise, we can maybe make this guy move. No, yeah, this way is clockwise, sorry. And do that. And then hit plus, make these guys linear by selecting them, press 4. And then as you can see, our object is also rotating at the same time. Obviously, it's kind of a bit hard to tell because we have a white background and nothing behind it. You can't really tell what's moving, if it's the camera or the object, but you kind of get the idea of how I'm kind of using this to get some cool shots, especially on those close-up sort of barreling, rotaty shots. Now, one thing, if you are animating the rotation and you find, let me see if I can recreate it. So you start here. Let me actually delete my camera keyframe because I don't want my camera to move. So now we have our product rotating. Let's say, for example, you selected your rotator down here. Also, it doesn't have to be down here. I just did it because I'm lazy. And then you make a keyframe there. You'll notice it's barely moving because it's just going from 0 degrees to -6 because of the way it's calculating negative values or positive values. Sometimes it can be a bit glitchy. One thing to fix that is you can right click on the transform track, go to properties and say use quaternion interpolation. And now if you redo your keyframes this way and then hit plus, now it'll actually move between those real values. So this is something that can be useful if you don't have, if you're noticing it's rotating the incorrect way or moving the incorrect way. Try doing the quaternion values. Use quaternion interpolation, and if that's still not working, you might just have to check the values yourself in here and then add 360 to it or whatever it is, because it can get a bit glitchy in the sequencer timeline. All right, the final part of the sequencer stuff, at least outside of rendering, is just creating a master sequence to set up all your shots. So what I mean by that is if I click this, you can see I have all those little shots that I made before, and I've kind of placed them in a master sequence track so that I can get a feel for timing and pace and also the order of shots if I'm missing anything. That's kind of how I decided, like, oh, I don't actually need this shot, or I didn't need this shot, that kind of thing. So really good for storyboarding and putting something together. Let me show you how to quickly set that up. So if I go back into this tutorial folder, right click, do the exact same thing, cinematics, level sequence, I'll call it ls underscore AirPods Max Toot underscore master. Double click that. And what I actually like to do is drag this out to be a floating window just for this part. And first things first, you want to add a camera cut track so that when you hit render, it'll actually look at the cameras within your subsequence. And then what you can do from there is go to track, subsequence, and you can do plus and look for it manually, or you can just drag in your different shots into the timeline itself. You just want to make sure you have enough space in your in and outs to do that, and then drag your S2 in, and I like to just drag it down so I can clearly see the difference between where a shot begins and ends. Now we can finally jump into the render settings. Alright, so for the render settings, this should be pretty simple. I won't go into too much depth. You just have your sequencer open, whether it's an individual shot or the master sequence, up to you guys. Click this icon, render this movie to a video, and that'll pop up movie render queue. Now here you can set up your render settings. So I ended up using this guy here, which I go through in my render passes video, but I will go through each one. If you are setting up a new one like this, what you can do is just delete everything except output, obviously, and then you can add in what I'm about to show you. So I'll hit cancel, and I just did JPEG. I didn't need to do EXR because I wasn't going to do any crazy color correcting or any crypto matte passes and things like that. Again, check out my render passes video if you are trying to do that, but I was happy with all my settings within the engine, which is kind of the advantage of it. And like I said, I was changing my exposure in camera anyways, so I was happy with that. So these are the settings I used for this. So I just did a JPEG, and then deferred rendering. I didn't have any, these are all default settings. As for anti-aliasing, I did 8 in spatial and 4 in temporal. Usually you'll see people do 16 and 1 or something like that. I don't think you need that many temporal samples unless you have a lot of motion happening. So that's where I found this balance to be quite good. This is still pretty high. You could just do, 4 and 2 or something like that. But I found 8 and 4 to be nice. It doesn't take too long, and I still get quite a clean render out. For color output, I've got nothing checked, so I'm not doing any ACES conversion or anything like that. No raw or log output or disabled tone curve, nothing like that. Console variables, I have one thing, depth of field quality on, which I actually don't even need. I could have turned this off, I just realized. So I didn't really need any console variables. I have game overrides enabled, and this should come in exactly like this, but this is just sort of maximizing all the settings like cinematic quality, LOD 0, all of that stuff. So this should be fine by default. Now in output, this is actually where I think some useful things can be shown. Obviously make sure your frame rate matches the sequencer settings you have. So I'm on 30. My output resolution, make sure that matches your cropped aspect ratio. Otherwise you'll have some weird rendered in black bars. So always make sure your output resolution ratio, aspect ratio, matches your camera aspect ratio. And as for the output and file naming formats, these are some useful tokens that you can actually see down here that you can use for your naming conventions. I like to output to the project directory, which is the location of the project, and then I have a folder called MRQ for movie render queue, and then I do curly brackets sequence name, date and time. That way it doesn't override anything, and then it also means I have like a log of everything that I've rendered in the correct order. So that's all I use for my output directory. And then for the file name format, I do sequence name and then frame number. You can do, camera name, time, year, month, level name, all of that stuff. I just like sequence name and frame number, because then when I import it into Resolve or After Effects, I can clearly see what shot this is and what level or sequence it was in. One other thing I actually didn't mention is my render warm-up and engine warm-up count is 64 and 64, so I've also changed that. And I'm pretty sure that is about it. So I think for all of these renders combined, as in all of these guys, at 4K took around, I want to say it took around an hour for all of these to be rendered. And these are long clips. These are like 10 to 20 to even 20 plus second clips that I just wanted a bunch of extra cushion so that I could make the cuts where I want to in post, depending on the music track and all of that. Hopefully this was helpful. I know I talked a lot about stuff. Let me know if I missed anything or skipped over anything that you thought would be very useful to you. I would be more than happy to answer you in the comments. And like and subscribe, and see you in the next one. Peace.